North Carolina's congressional and legislative redistricting process is moving forward. Lawmakers have adopted the criteria they will use when drafting new election maps. Joining us to take a look at the criteria is Dr. Andy Jackson. He is director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity at the John Locke Foundation. And Andy, what struck you most about these criteria?
Well, I guess the thing that struck me most are what they're not going to be considering, specifically political data such as voter registration data, past election results, and demographic data, particularly on race. These are things that had tripped up the redistricting process in lawsuits before. Previously, going back to the middle of the last decade on racial data, and then again just in 2019 using political data, which, by the way, was specifically allowed under the Stevenson versus Bartlett ruling back in 2002. They said, oh yeah, you may consider political data in that circumstances. But a couple of decades later, the courts say, no, now you can't. And I think the General Assembly kind of got a feel for what the courts are expecting, what's going to be successful in lawsuits, what's not going to be successful, and they said it's probably best if we just stay away from that data, kind of repeat the process that we had with a couple of lawsuits back in 2019.
Is it helpful for the General Assembly that they just recently went through this process? This is supposed to take place every 10 years, but we just went through this a couple years ago.
I don't know if anybody in the General Assembly ever thinks it's helpful if they have to go through this process several times. I think it definitely was educational for the members because, as I mentioned, using political data, partisan considerations, had been something that had been specifically allowed before. And so maybe it's for the best that they found this out, that the courts now consider the use of partisan data, at least an extreme use of partisan data, to be something that violates the North Carolina Constitution, the Free Election Clause specifically. So this way they can go through this full process, hopefully have learned their lesson, aren't going to be using this kind of data that got them into trouble last time around, and they'll have a process that hopefully will survive the next round of lawsuits, which are sure to come.
And in fact, legislative leaders, the people who are involved in this process, have drawn attention to the fact that they're not going to use this partisan data. This is not something they're trying to hide. They're actually trumpeting the fact that they've decided not to use it.
They are, and there were, of course, no matter which way you go, people are going to complain what you're doing. I was at a hearing where I started to hear folks complain, oh no, you really need to use this partisan data so we can draw whatever your concept of a fair map is. But I think it really is much more practical. What you really want to do is have a neutral set of criteria, respect North Carolina's political geography, county lines, where people settle, and just draw by that kind of neutral set or pattern and not worry about the partisan data. That stuff will sort itself out.
Yeah, in fact, what you're describing reminds me that people approach this in a couple different ways. Some say, let's go ahead and devise this so we get to some certain political outcome, while others say, wait a minute, the whole process of redistricting is supposed to be just to set up districts that make it easy for people who live near each other to vote for the same folks.
Right. And there's an inherent conflict there. And even within those two approaches, there are sub-approaches which are often at odds. For example, if you're going to use political data to try to drive some kind of outcome, what is that outcome? Obviously, for most of the history of North Carolina, it was the majority party writing districts that are the most beneficial to the majority party. There are others that say the goal should be making as many competitive districts as possible. Other people say, well, you should have the delegation to Congress or to the state legislature be about proportional to the pool of voters in the state. And so all of those kinds of things are in conflict, and it's almost impossible to have all of those at the same time. So settling on any kind of criteria other than, say, we're going to have a neutral standard, you really start getting into a briar bush.
If you looked at all of the potential criteria that would be good for this process, your gold standard, and then you look at what the General Assembly has just adopted, how close are they?
Actually, I think it's pretty close. So once again, I think this is kind of school of hard knocks that the General Assembly has gone through over the past several decades with these various lawsuits and fine adjustments. I like that they've settled on these kind of neutral criteria, compactness, for example, respecting county borders, not just as required by the North Carolina Constitution for state legislative seats, but also they said they're going to try to avoid dividing counties when drawing congressional districts. That's a good thing because that helps avoid some of those really crazy serpentine configurations of districts that we had seen over previous decades. The only thing that I'm really not a fan of is that they decided to include consideration of incumbents' residencies to avoid what we call double bunking, so that you don't draw districts that pull two incumbents into the same position. Now, there is an argument to be made for that, and not just, hey, it's benefiting us, that people that have established relationships, members of the legislature with their constituents, shouldn't just be written out and forced to compete with other incumbents, that should really be left up to the voters. But the problem is, as populations shift, it gets harder and harder to maintain some of these borders, and you sometimes have to draw some very strange configurations to try to keep an incumbent within their prior district. So I would have liked that not to be considered, but they did say this is a may, not a shall, which is important. So they don't have to consider it, but they can take it on a case-by-case basis.
As the redistricting process moves forward, we know that one person who will be paying very close attention is Dr. Andy Jackson. He is director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity at the John Locke Foundation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.